Hello and welcome everyone to our 10th IUC Alumni Talks. For those of you who are returning, welcome back. And for those of you who are new, welcome. I'm glad you've all taken the time to attend today's event. So before we begin, if you haven't already, make sure to mute yourself in the bottom left. It is the mic icon. And then if you'd like, change your display name to your first name, last name, and the IUC graduation year if you have attended the IUC. Okay, and then now a short introduction from each of our current organizing members, and I will start. My name is Jasmine Ramos. I graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee last year for Japanese studies and have just finished my time at the IUC for the 10-month program.
I'll go next. My name is Richard Sloboda. I went to the IUC in 2002 to 3. I've made Japan my base since then, left on 2 occasions, but came back. I work in the accounting profession, and I enjoy trail running throughout Japan and hosting these kind of events. Thanks for coming.
This is Charlie. I graduated in 2019 from the 10-month program. I'm still a PhD candidate in the Department of East Asian Language Cultures at Stanford University. I enjoyed practicing Aikido, PM, golf, bridge, and video chatting with my dog.
Okay, and for those who do not already know, the IUC Alumni Talks is a web series that aims to create a space for the IUC Alumni Network to share their personal journeys with each other and the interested public, including future IUC students. Through this series, we hope to build a strong community among people with diverse associations with Japan. And you can check out our past recordings of our talks on our YouTube channel at the following link. It'll be put in the chat as well, or you can scan the QR code below. And these are actually the past speakers that we have had so far. And for today's program, we will first introduce our guest speaker, followed by a moderator-led conversation, an interactive quiz using Menti, a Q&A session, and then we will have the wrap-up. After that, we will have an optional post-event networking session that, of course, you can choose to attend if you have the time. And I will now pass the online mic to Richard.
Okay, thanks, Jasmine. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another IUC Alumni Talks. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome Dan Zoot as our speaker. Dan grew up in Chicago, where he first began studying Japanese and practicing Kendo as a teenager. In the mid-1980s, he studied engineering for 2 years at Columbia University before obtaining and accepting an appointment to the Naval Academy, from which he graduated with a major in naval architecture, while continuing his classroom Japanese studies. After his graduation in 1991, at a time when Japan's economic bubble was bursting, Dan joined the US Navy, where he was trained as a naval propulsion officer, and he spent 3 years aboard the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier. After serving 5 years in the Navy, a period during which, surprisingly, he had little to no contact with Japan, Dan met his future wife, May, who has her camera on, thank you, May, and learned from her about the IUC. He applied to and attended the IUC on a Shoyu Club fellowship, thriving on the discipline and intensity after more than a decade of part-time Japanese classes and self-study. After the IUC, Dan began a career in the aerospace and defense industry, working first for Space Systems Loral, then defense giant Raytheon for nearly 20 years, including stints, which he'll talk about a bit, in Aomori and Nagoya. And he also obtained an MBA with a focus on leadership and operations from Yale School of Management in 2001. Beginning last year, Dan took up a new role as leader of the new Tokyo headquarters of aerospace and defense firm L3Harris Technologies. So Dan, thanks for making time to share with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to talk to them.
Okay, so I thought we could start from the beginning. So you're our first speaker to attend the IUC in the 90s, which means you started studying Japanese before Duolingo, YouTube, even Ajido and Canon Word Tank. So can you tell us about your first encounters with the Japanese language and what it was like to study at that time, as well as your first trip to Japan?
Yes. My father was a U.S. Army officer in the occupational forces in Korea, and he would spend he had spent a couple of visits on R&R in Japan during his time in Korea, and he was fascinated by Japan and brought back a lot of artifacts, prints, pottery, masks, and things like that, and books. And my first encounter with Japanese language was seeing Japanese writing in some of the items that he had brought back from Japan. And so my interest in Japanese language started from seeing Japanese written language, especially the combination of kanji and kana. And the first thing I did was I wanted to learn Japanese writing. And so I at that time there was in Chicago, there was a relatively large Japanese American community, many people who had relocated after the internment to Chicago. And there were resources were available, but at that time, very little language study materials for foreigners interested in studying Japanese were available. It was primarily those materials that were available to Japanese kids who were going to Hoshuko and things like that. And then also the English language study materials that Japanese people use. So it was like an Eiwa Jiten was English to Japanese in kanji. And my first Japanese language textbook was actually a book that was intended for Japanese kids who were expatriates in the United States called Atarashi Sansu. It was first grade Atarashi Sansu. And I didn't know what Sansu was at the time. And some of the limitations of that kind of a study environment were, for example, I didn't know that the word shimasu, the root word was actually suru, because shimasu is not in the dictionary. And I didn't know the conjugate. It took me like 7 or 9 years to figure out how to conjugate, the word suru. Shortly after I learned kanji and kana, I decided, I should probably learn the Japanese language. And the first place where I studied Japanese was actually at the Buddhist Temple Chicago Japanese Language School, which was a school that ministered to the interests of the Japanese American community in Chicago. One of the most famous graduates of that program is David Spector, who some of us may know, as a television commentator and personality in Japan. So after studying Japanese for about 7 years, from age 10 to about 17, my first chance to go to Japan was through a homestay that was arranged by my Kendo teachers, where I stayed with 2 families, one in Yokohama and one in Osaka for 5 weeks apiece. One of the homestay mothers in Osaka had a master's degree in English and literature, and spoke English, but very deliberately, she never spoke to me in English the entire time I was staying with them. And they understood that one of the things that they could do for me was help me improve my Japanese. And so that was my first real chance to be immersed during that summer when I was 17.
Thanks, Dan. Wow. So that's just at 17, you'd already had that experience of getting immersed in Kendo, doing a homestay. So even though I think you had, thinking about my own experience, you had sort of the handicap of not having access to all these amazing digital tools that people have today. But on the other hand, it sounds like you had pretty good early exposure.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you've always thrived in that environment of discipline, whether in the dojo or, like you were saying, being thrown into a homestay where they speak English, but they won't speak it to you. So it sounds like you really thrived in the environment at the Naval Academy. And then, of course, that was probably good preparation for the IUC. So you describe yourself as a language person first. When we started discussing, and I said, "Oh, you're the first military person, ex-military person that we've spoken to, you said, clearly I'm a language person first, but yet you studied some very challenging stuff at Columbia and then the Naval Academy. So can you tell us a bit about that experience and what your 5 years in the Navy was like?
Well, yes, actually, my interest in the military was really very separate from my interest in Japan. But one of the things that I think helped me make that transition from civilian life to military environment, military lifestyle, was my involvement in Kendo and Judo. And certain aspects of the practice of Judo and Kendo really assisted me in that. You know, for example, like the senpai kohai thing, the idea that, like, you know, there's a structure of ranks, the idea that someone who is more senior than you, who has more experience than you, is often going to ask things of you which are not pleasant, but are for your own good. You know, that kind of thing. You know, the basics of aisatsu, for example, aisatsu, which is huge in Kendo and in Japanese culture. You know, lesson 1 at the Naval Academy is aisatsu, interestingly enough. So, you know, those kind of things helped. Another thing, which is definitely an ethic, which is exists in both the military and in Japanese Budo, is this idea that you should have equal portions of scholarship and also physical activity. You know, Bunbu Yodo, that concept of martial arts or sports, and that's also something that is, you know, fully embodied in Surface Academy lifestyle as well. And, you know, I want to, you know, the time that I spent on the aircraft carrier, I was the nuclear propulsion officer on an aircraft carrier, and there is not much downtime, you know, in a job like that. But what downtime there is on an aircraft carrier at sea, which is like a floating prison, and so there's plenty of time to, you know, to dig deep in things. And so I actually did a lot of self-study during that period. And then at the end of that time, I really wanted to have a chance. I wanted to become literate in Japanese. You know, that was one of my longtime goals. I really wanted to be able to read some of the Japanese literature I'd read in English in the original Japanese. And so when the time came to leave the Navy, it really wasn't possible for me to serve in the Navy in Japan, because at that time, Japan did not want nuclear propelled surface ships to be home ported in Japan. And because the Navy had spent so much time investing in my training to be a propulsion officer, I wouldn't have had much chance to come to Japan through the Navy in that community. And so I chose to leave the Navy and learned about the center. And so, and actually, there's really only 2 things that I've done in my life, that two major life choices that I made, which were not in the interest of doing something immediately that has to do with Japan. One of those was the choice of going to the Naval Academy, and the other one was the choice of nuclear propulsion as my warfare specialty. And but ultimately, those things actually led to greater opportunities in Japan. So no immediate benefit to getting to Japan, but in the long term, I'm where I am today because of that.
Well, that's great to hear. Obviously, that fire that was sparked by those artifacts that your father brought back, and your Atarashi Sansu. Can't imagine learning Japanese from a math book, but that sounds like that passion was burning the whole time you were in your floating prison. So you get off the ship, you leave the Navy, and the first thing you do is to pick up where you left off with your Japanese studies. Can you tell us a bit about what brought you to the IUC and what some of your best memories are from your year there?
Well, yes. So it was May is what brought me to the IUC, and you know, I had told a friend in Seattle that, like, I was interested, while I was still in the Navy, I was interested in going to Japan and studying. He said, "I will introduce you to this young lady who has just come back from Japan, studying intensely." And I was like, oh, you know, he's not going to introduce me to some young lady, and he did, and we met, and somehow we ended up being more interested in getting to know each other than talking about the IUC. But then May was getting a master's degree in Japanese literature at University of Washington at that time. And one day she came back from school and I came back from work and she had a flyer for the Blakemore. And she said, there's the scholarship that you could get to go and study at this program that originally you and I were supposed to talk about. So I applied to the Blakemore, got rejected from the Blakemore. I'd been saving my money, and wanted to do this anyway. So I applied, got accepted. And Stacy Campbell, the administrator at the time, had said, Daniel, you've done so well on the exam, you're going to get some funding. And then when the funding letter came, it said, congratulations, you have been awarded $0, but that was okay. I ended up joining Spaces with Laurel, which was a Palo Alto company. And so when I got to Palo Alto, I reached out to Stacy and I told her, I'm here in Palo Alto, let's get together and for lunch. And at lunch, I said to her, I was really surprised that you told me I was going to get this funding and then I didn't get the funding. And she says, yeah, it's just things didn't work out. And then the last day I was at Laurel before I left for Japan, I get a call at 4 p.m. and it's Stacy. And she says, Daniel, do you have a second? I said, sure, no problem. Let me guess, you're going to offer me money. And she says, how does $20,000 sound? and so the Shoyu Club came through. So then a couple of days later, May and I went to the airport at SFO, and we're standing at that time you could go all the way up to the the jetway, and she says to me, Daniel, get ready. When you get to the center, a Japanese person is going to sit across from you. After there's going to be a test, then there's going to be a role play, which is going to be filmed, and then you're going to receive the results of your evaluation. And a Japanese person, for the first time in your life, is going to tell you exactly how terrible your Japanese is. And then that person is going to tell you exactly what the next thing is that you need to do to fix it. And I was like, nonsense. And sure enough, Otake Hiroko Sensei sat across from me and said, something? She said a couple things. She said, Daniel, your Japanese is quite remarkable, but first of all, communication is not just about talking, it's also about listening. And you need to do a little bit more of that. And the other thing she said to me was that she said, I spoke with no recognition whatsoever of the difference between Jidoshi and Kadoshi. And if I didn't fix that, I would sound like an idiot for the rest of my life. Is basically, actually a foreign idiot attempting to speak Japanese for the rest of my life. And May was right. That was exactly the way it was. And yet, I really, I thrived in that. And one of the other things that I really worked well for me, but not necessarily for others, was this practice that they had of having us take a writing assignment every day, write, and then at home think, and then write, and then come back the next day and submit the paragraph or essay, and then speak about what we wrote about while being corrected. And most of the students didn't like that, but I thought it gave rise to an interesting dynamic of competition, which for me, especially because of my military background, it actually worked quite well for me. Although a lot of people crumpled under that, it would work for me. So that was good.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. Yeah, the recordings were very, very tough, but yeah, to be in that environment where they actually, follow up with you, like you said, correcting everything, and to be able to go back and listen to that, that's something actually, once you leave the center, you realize what a precious opportunity that was. Okay, so you've made your home in Japan ever since the IUC. Obviously, you spent a lot of time leading up to the IUC. You really tackled your studies there with gusto, and so you've built your career here in Japan since. So I'm curious. The defense industry is something that's quite unfamiliar to me, and I'm guessing a lot of people on this call. So can you sort of walk us through some of the more interesting projects you've had over the course of your career?
Yes, absolutely. So Laurel, and a lot of times, in the whole time, I have most of the time marketed myself as a Japanese linguist, as I can do all these things, plus I have this Japanese language ability. And one point that I think is very pertinent, possibly to every industry, every American industry in Japan, is that most often the evaluator of the Japanese language ability doesn't have the ability to evaluate it. And so, everyone is sort of, considered equal, and no one's ability is really fully understood. Oftentimes the ability is not even believed by the Japanese, and the evaluator herself or himself can't even evaluate. But I marketed myself that way and got several jobs along the way on the basis of that, but actually used the language in very, very important ways. And one of the things that was one of my first experiences with L'Oreal was I was expected to read and sign the handwritten minutes of a 4-hour meeting that happened every week for the 5 years I worked at L'Oreal. And that was where I learned to read Japanese handwriting. And in that meeting situation, for example, if I asked the Japanese to repeat themselves, some of the not nice people would say to me, something? The language of this contract is Japanese language, and we are not paying you to ask us to repeat ourselves. And so, in that environment, certain capabilities I was able to really expand on. When I moved to Aomori, I attempted in the beginning I asked some of my vendors to, if I could write to them in English and they could write back to me in Japanese, that would be fine. And that didn't work. And so that wasn't a chance for me to really work on writing, because up until then I did a lot of reading, but not a lot of writing. And so what we were doing in Aomori, is my company, Raytheon company, deployed a missile defense radar to northern Japan, which was in response to the 1997 overflight by the North Korean missile. And we deployed a radar, and we deployed 30 employees and 30 dependents to a region of Japan where no Americans had ever lived. And I actually brought my family there. My boys were 2 and 4 years old at the time, and they grew up in that part of the country. It was an incredible experience. It was a lot of people would ask me, like, well, did you encounter discrimination and the fact is, most of the people up there had never met Americans in their lives. They had no preconceptions about what Americans were like. And we did not have a single negative experience. I would say any negative experience that we had was a misunderstanding on our part. And misunderstandings were prevalent too, because of the fact that they speak a slightly different, dialect of Japanese up there. But that was a wonderful experience. The next one, after that, after it became clear that my children were not going to become bilingual in English, we had the opportunity to move to another location where there was an international school. And we moved to Nagoya, where I was asked to assist the company in a joint U.S.-Japan research, design, and manufacturing program for a next generation ballistic missile defense interceptor missile, which was another incredible experience, working on a highly complex engineering project with a Japanese counterpart company, which was also very high profile, and it was a chance to, which also set the stage for the job I have now, because I was doing something in Japan with the Japanese government and with U.S. industry and stuff like that. I also met at that time I met Chris Hange, who I don't know if Chris is on the call at the moment. Chris, give a shout if you're out there today. Who was a CIR at the Tsugaru City Hall, and Chris and I became friends, and Chris ended up going to the center, and now I think he was one of the speakers recently. He's done incredible things, like with his starting a company in Japan and selling something that everyone wants.
Beer.
So that's
yeah, Dan, you mentioned one thing I asked you when we were, oh, by the way, so Chris is one of the founders of Kyoto Brewing Company, just give him a little pitch there. And their interview is on our YouTube channel. One other thing that you mentioned I thought was interesting, Dan, is I said, well, what's one of the characteristics of working in the defense sector? And obviously you said, I can't compare it to other sectors because I don't have that experience, but you
Yeah.
did highlight one point about defense sector. I'm sorry about you. You mentioned how it was interesting given the U.S. Japan security relationship,
Yes.
how the U.S. tends to be sort of the leader in a lot of projects.
Yes, yeah, in defense projects, absolutely. And, there's like, whereas I think, in that, like, Japan fundamentally goes to like, the Japanese Defense Force is closely allied, of course, with with the US military. And in that regard, like, there's business development activities in Japan are not quite the same as they are for other industries, like the automotive industry, where Japan is absolutely, or the world leader and stuff like that, whereas in defense. And so one of the ways, I'm not sure if I remember exactly what the aspect was that we talked about before, but like when it comes to language, for example, there really are not very many linguists, Japanese linguists in the defense area. I expect that in finance or real estate or automotive there would be, but in defense there are not. And like a lot of times, there's we have another graduate. I don't know if Blaine is with us today. Blaine Erickson, who's my classmate from 97, who is the first ever non-heritage language instructor at the Defense Language Institute. And a lot of times the military linguists are, for example, they're the best, their ability is the best that it ever is on the day that they graduate from the Language Institute. And then, because of the nature of the industry with the small number, the expectations are basically low. The expectations for language capability are extremely low in the defense aerospace sector. And a lot of times people give up and they just say, something, my counterparts, English language ability is so much better than my Japanese. And people sometimes, tend to give up. And, it kind of brings back something. I don't know if this is the context that we've spoken about, but there's a martial arts concept that is absolutely true in language acquisition, I believe, which is the idea that language capability is not something that is taught, it is something that is stolen. And in the context I'm talking about right now is, given the opportunity in aerospace, your Japanese counterparts are going to speak to you in English. And if you want to improve your Japanese, you're going to have to, I wouldn't say stuff it down their throats, but, stuff it down their throats. And it's just, and that's a very traditional idea in the martial arts and maybe other aspects of Japanese culture where, the teacher, the mentor's job isn't to teach you. It's you observe and you steal like whatever it is that you're going to get. And so, that's one characteristic.
Yeah.
And yet, like, yeah, that's really, was that what we'd spoken about before?
Yeah. No, I thought it was interesting. Just thinking about the role of language, considering that the defense industry, public sector, I would imagine it's quite different from the areas a lot of us work in. So no, that's all interesting reference points. So going back to sort of defense in general and the security relationship between the two countries, obviously you've seen a lot of changes. And with Abe-san's passing recently, I think there've been reflections on his legacy. The sort of geopolitical stage has changed tremendously since the 90s. I'm just curious, what are your observations on how things have changed in your 20 years in this industry?
Yes, it's incredible. I mean, and every year it's different and significantly different. But I mean, some of the biggest changes that come to mind is there used to be this thing called the 3 Principles Prohibiting Weapons Exports, which has been modified. It's a constitutional interpretation. It is weapons export is not prohibited by the Constitution of Japan. It's interpretations, and now what used to be the 3 principles prohibiting weapons export are now the 3 principles allowing defense equipment transfer. And so that is a big change. There are not a tremendous number of examples of Japanese companies exporting, but Japanese companies have actually been exporting defense articles under the guise of dual use, for a long time anyway. But it's now much more. There's now a concrete protocol for that. That's one example. Another big change is the idea of collective self-defense. The idea that Japan, in certain situations, should be allowed to not only protect itself, but also protect an ally in certain situations where life is threatened for Japanese or Japanese partners. That is a big change. Another big change, which is the idea that Japan at the moment right now is Japan has begun to consider, when you talk about defense capability may be, next generation aircraft or missiles that can fly very far and that kind of thing. But the ability to design and manufacture and supply one's own defense equipment in itself is a defense capability. And so one of the huge themes of defense contracting in Japan right now is the idea that Japanese companies are going to do everything they possibly can to manufacture their own equipment. And so the task for foreign providers of equipment is Japan is no longer going to buy your finished systems, maybe. And so you need to figure out ways of partnering. You need to figure out ways of collaborating, whereas before, that wasn't necessarily the case because they would just buy the products wholesale.
Interesting. Yeah, that's seems like it would be an area in terms of business and the economy and growth, an area that actually Japan should have a lot of room, starting from a relatively low base, I would think, in terms of exports. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. Okay, so going back to language, it's been great to hear some specifics from your area. And when we were planning this talk, I said, if there's anything sensitive in the defense area that you don't want to talk about, that's fine. And you said, no, nothing I have to say about defense or the security situation is controversial. However, I have some controversial opinions on language acquisition. So I'm sure this is the audience to air those thoughts. So what do you think is key to learning Japanese, and what advice would you have? We actually have at least, I think, maybe 5 future students on the call. What's your advice to them?
So a couple things, like one of the, and I'll talk about the Otaka sensei, the writing, that assignment thing in a second. But I think a lot of times Japanese people will ask me, like, how do I learn English? What is the secret? And one of the the most controversial things, probably the most controversial thing I will say is that, is get this idea out of your head that there's an easy way to do this. It's not easy. It's not easy for anyone. I didn't okay, I started early, but I came to the center I was 29 years old when I entered this, when I was 24 plus 7. I was 29 years old when I went to the center. So I had at that point 12 years of language study under my belt, and so, it might appear that it was easy. It wasn't easy. So that's one thing. The other thing is, what I tell people is there's 4 kinds of people that excel in language learning. People who are interested in a particular subject, which is accessible only through the language. People who are purely, interested in the language. People who are a blabbermouth, who are interested in other people and talk a lot. And then the other group of people is people who are interested in imposing their will on others. And, I think I'm actually all 4 of those. So, that's one of the, maybe controversial ideas. The other thing was, I talked about stealing the language. That's a little bit, the idea that, it's all about me. People ask me about the difference between fencing and Kendo, and maybe we can talk about it later. And people say, is there this concept in Kendo of right of way, as there is in Western fencing? And I was like, no, actually, in Kendo, it's my turn all the time. And it's the same thing with language. It is my turn all the time. And that's that's what I've done. People say, how many years have you studied Japanese? Did you study Japanese? I'm not done. I'm still studying. That's one aspect of it. And then another thing I wanted to talk about is this assignment that we had at the center, which I'm sure you still have, which is at one stage, you're asked to exercise your knowledge of Sonke-go or Tene-go and Kenjo-go by presenting one of your instructors with a newspaper article or a short, synopsis of something to read, and then you're supposed to ask your teacher about it. And for this assignment, I took an article from the Japan Times that was an interview with 4 prominent Americans in Japan who were known to be high-level language users, Japanese language users. And they were asked by the reporter to talk about how good should your Japanese language skill be. And the conclusion of the article, I don't know if it was Glenn Fukushima or if it was David Spector, who said, in order to make the Japanese people comfortable, you should speak Japanese slightly less well than you're capable. And so I presented this to Otake Sensei, and Otake Sensei said to me, no, that's wrong. You should speak the best possible Japanese that you can, so that you can teach all of the Japanese people around you that you interact with, that Americans or non-Japanese people are capable of speaking proper, excellent Japanese. And that became, my mandate from that moment, or sort of life work. That sounds like a big thing, but when someone says, how we also have in the book, like what to say when someone comments on your Japanese, and there's like nanchatte, and there's like, yeah, mada mada desu, and all this kind of thing. A friend of mine who's not a center grad says that when someone says Nihongo Josenet, his response is to say to them, "Hi, ojozu desu," which is not what I say, but like, that is a good way of stopping the trend of the conversation when you say that, "Hi, ojozu desu." In my case, what I like best is when the person doesn't say anything, or when the person says, "You speak very polite, accurate Japanese." That is something that I appreciate, because that is exactly what I'm trying to do.
Well, that sounds like could be the selling line for the IUC, definitely. And your point about it never being finished, that definitely resonates with me too, especially when you leave Japan for a bit and come back, you're sort of reinstilled with this enthusiasm for getting better. So I think that's something a lot of people on this call would definitely agree with. So I thought I'd close out the interview portion with going back to Kendo, and I think there's even maybe 1 or 2 of your Kendo buddies on the call. So I've only done a tiny bit of martial arts, karate, and I've seen Kendo. It seems like a lot of gear. It seems really hot, and it seems quite different from a lot of the other martial arts, but I'm not sure how. So with all the different martial arts and activities and sports to choose from, I saw kids doing capoeira, like in the Shotengai recently. What is it about Kendo that makes it so special?
Well, one of the things is that Kendo is like, first of all, Kendo is actually the most widely practiced martial art in Japan. A lot of people don't know that. And the reason is because, in terms of numbers of people, because Kendo can be practiced at a very high level until late in life. I practiced with people who 79, 82 years old, people who can take me to task. And, it's also because it is not purely like an upper body strength, kind of thing. It can be practiced very, very on a high level by women against men. As a matter of fact, like in the testing area, like, testing for the higher ranks in Kendo, or actually in Japan, all ranks, and in the United States for that matter, women and men are mixed. If you're going for 7th degree in Nanadan and Kendo, like, as a woman, you're up against the men. And the reason is because it's not about strength, it's about the capability. So, I mean, that's definitely one thing in terms of the ability to do it competitively and for one's entire life is one aspect of it. Another thing that, is about Kendo, which is, and this is definitely true of other martial arts, but, I think has been, became significantly, I became aware of this during the coronavirus time, is the sense of community that one gets. And, I realized after, Kendo went away actually at the beginning of coronavirus. And, it has the sanmitsu, like you're in a tight space. Everyone's, huffing and puffing. and it's hot, and there's 40 people in a space that normally would have like 10 people, and all of a sudden, like, no more practice. And what I recognized, I practice Kendo 4 or 5 times a week, and sometimes see some of the same people 4 or 5 times a week. Sometimes not necessarily practice with that individual, but see the person in the dojo in the morning while we're dressing. And when Kendo went away because of Corona, that connection with people went away as well. And and that's when I realized that, like, there's a lot more to this than just like the health maintenance and that kind of thing. It's also just to be able to connect with people on a regular basis. And so that's one of the things that now I really value about it.
Great, thanks, Dan. So I think if people have further questions about Kendo or martial arts or the military language, we can cover those in the Q&A. For now, I think we'll move on to we always have a fun activity during these sessions with Mentimeter. So Tarani, if you can share that the Mentimeter join slide. So there's 3 ways to join Mentimeter. You can either scan this QR code with your phone, which we recommend, or I think we'll be able to put a link on your PC into the chat, the Zoom chat.
It's already there.
Yep, excellent. Or you can type in menti.com and this 8-digit code and join, and we'll have a bit of fun here. So for this time's Mentimeter, we're going full otaku, and we're going to do a kanji quiz. So for those of you who don't speak Japanese, I think there might be a couple of Dan's overseas colleagues or friends who maybe won't be able to follow this. We apologize for that, but I think the majority of us on this call are IUCers, so we'll see how this goes. I think Tarani has an advantage. Some of our Chinese speaker colleagues might have an advantage here. Can you see the screen? Showing up? Okay. All right, 21 people. Anyone else? You can also join you at the top. You can join at any point. So let's go. Okay, so what is the bamboo sword used for Kendo practice called? So we have 4 options. They're quite small on the screen. Shinai, Takemitsu, Chikuken, or Bokuto. Which of these is the bamboo sword? Not a whole lot of time there. Ah, excellent. So is this common? I did not know this. That's why. Should I know this, Dan?
Well, it's in the center. It's in the kanji and context textbook.
Oh,
yeah.
I see Jasmine nodding. Whoops. Okay. Good thing there are no senseis on this call. Yeah, no, I did not know that. I know Bokuto, but I did not know Shinai. I would have failed that one. Excellent. And apparently the third one is from a Chinese online fantasy novel. There's like some sword called the Chikuken. That's not actually what is Takemitsu? I'm forgetting what this is. Yeah, this is something else. Okay. So tricked a few people, but most of you got it. Well done. And the sooner you answer, the more points you get. So well done, Ronald. Okay, question number 2. Okay, what does kunshi hyohen refer to? Yonmoji jukugo. So we give you a bit more time here. Change to match one's master, to blend in among peers, to seek to correct one's mistakes, or to wait for the best time to strike. This is one of Dan's favorite Yonmoji jukugo, apparently. Ooh. What do you think, Dan?
I looked it up again this morning, and I would have actually had it be changed to what match one's master, But it's definitely seek differential mistakes.
Excellent.
But
So,
my sort of take on it is relative to it's just the idea that like you need to someone who is like a highly capable person like actively addresses any mistakes that they have and corrects them in order to get better, which is certainly something that's important in Kendo development.
excellent. Yo, there's some English phrase about a leopard changing its spots. I know that has a different meaning, but that's like,
Well, actually, Iva said like a tiger doesn't change its stripes. Iva,
okay.
and that's actually quoted to her, but that's a whole nother story.
Okay. Oh, Dan, you're not allowed to play.
Oh.
unless there's a doppelganger here.
No, that was me. But like, I wasn't.
Yeah, sometimes you get in that mode. I've done this too before. Okay, so the next one is a little setup. So the Kaijo Jietai, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces, the destroyers Goeikan are named after weather, mountains, rivers, or regions, and then different other classes of ships have different naming schemes. So this is related to destroyers, which are being produced every year and launched around Japan. So which of the following names is not the name of a Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force destroyer? Hakuge, Haguro, Mogami, or Yahagi? Weather, mountains, river, or regions?
This is going to be interesting.
Okay, so Hakuge, I think of Moby Dick, like the white whale. Right?
The only reason I would have gotten this one is because I'm actually, it's the subject of my work.
Yeah, so the Hakuge is apparently a submarine, and submarines are named after oceanic phenomenon, marine animals, and mythical animals. And the Yahagi-gawa is apparently a river in Nagano, Gifu, and Aichi. And this was a ship launched in June 2022 in Nagasaki, built by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Mogami is a river in Yamagata. I think people probably figured that. And Yahagi is apparently in Yamagata-ken. Okay, let's see how people did on that. Oh, I think I skipped the leaderboard. Okay, so this is the last one, another Yonmoji Jukugo question. So which of these jukugo might a kendo sensei use to describe a flustered kendo student who's flailing ineffectively? So we have uto soso, kyuen torin, gyoran toho, and daso kyoda. Oh, I think I needed to give you more time. Sorry about that. Okay, well, a couple people managed to get that one. That might just be a factor of not enough time there, but so this is one of your favorite. This is one of your favorite.
I think the monkey gives it away. The fact that it has monkey in it. Yeah, this is like I think that there's numerous different similar ones in the Western vernacular. Any port in a storm is one of them, and it's the idea that like when you're under pressure, and my son, who's a wrestler, who's on the call right now, like definitely relate to this, is the idea that like whatever the techniques are that you have, which you're really good at, when you're under pressure, you're going to rely on those. And so like and that might not be like that might be the best thing when you're going against a very strong opponents, but like when you're going against someone who's like not necessarily like pressuring you the most, it's good to actually like try and master the techniques that you're less familiar with. And so the teacher would say like, you really need to actually like, go out on a limb and try, in order to increase your capability to actually try the stuff you're not good at when you're in those situations where you're under pressure, in order to actually expand your repertoire is what that really means to me.
Yeah, you can usually figure these out by the animal. The monkey doesn't always have the best reputation in these Yonmoji Jikugo. Sorry, I once again, I think I did this before. I didn't give everyone enough time, but nonetheless, Ronald, I'm not sure who Ronald is. If you're there, Ronald, maybe you can just give a shout out. Well done. And that wraps up our Menti session, and we have just a bit of time, about 8 minutes for Q&A, and then Dan will stick around for our breakout sessions afterwards. So anyone have any questions, feel free to turn on your camera, your mic, and ask directly, or you can type it in the chat.
We have one on the screen.
Okay. Yep. Oh, sorry, I was blocking that. Okay, so Dan, what are your thoughts on methods, opportunities for language acquisition? How they've changed over the years?
If the question is about, like, what are your, what are the different tools that you have, or the different materials you can use? I think that, like, the one that's the most interesting is YouTube. That's not what I do. What I typically do, and this is one that, like, if Rin is still on the call right now, hopefully he is, my son, he'll get a laugh out of this. Like, we were playing video games. I think that for me, I read a lot. I read a lot of different things. I also read for work. So reading is definitely one. Making an opportunity to actually talk to people, if that's something that you have, like, Japanese people in the United States or elsewhere, is one. But in the absence of those things, I think that, like, and there is, of course, a tremendous number of written language materials, more in Japan than there are outside Japan, but video games, actually. And, there's a game called Ratchet and Clank, which I don't know if anyone knows Ratchet and Clank, but, like, my sons and I used to play Ratchet and Clank together. And we're in this situation where, and what's good about video games for language acquisition is a lot of times there's a script that sometimes you can click through the script, or sometimes it's actually automatic where it advances, and if you don't pay attention, you miss it. And my son and I, Ren, if you're still out there, give a shout. We're playing Ratchet and Clank, and all of a sudden the spaceship loses gravity control, and I'm floating in the air, and I'm like, what the hell am I supposed to do? And Rin says to me, Daddy, I thought you spoke Japanese. Didn't you hear the announcement? And I'm like, I beg your pardon? And he said there was an announcement in the spaceship saying that, like, the magnetic field is about to, or the gravity field is about to go away, and so you need to put on the magnetic boots so that you can walk, like, on the ceiling and stuff like that. And so this is an example of how a game, a video game, could be a great tool. Most recently, I wish he was on the call, because I'd love for him to know about the center. There's a guy named Dogen who does a YouTube channel. There's a bunch of these things, but Dogen is one of the ones that I discovered very recently. And he focuses a lot on pronunciation and stuff like that. But, like, he has a YouTube thing where he does like vignettes where he does various characters at the same time, and in Japanese mostly. And I really, I think that his Japanese is excellent, but I think that he's not aiming for the low end of the audience. He's really, like, because I don't understand everything the guy says, but he takes different situations that you're going to encounter in Japan, and he does the role of the foreigner and of the Japanese people, and he talks. So this was not a written one, but the point is, YouTube is, like, there's a lot of great resources, I think, out on YouTube, and then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention all the great stuff there is on apps for the iPhone. My personal favorites on apps for iPhone for language study is the Daijin app, which is like $20, which is worth every penny as far as I'm concerned. It certainly beats carrying around, like, the 15-pound Daijin. And the other one is Wisho-Touch. I don't know if people know, give a shout if you know Wisho-Touch. Wisho-Touch is a handwriting recognition dictionary, which doesn't allow you, it doesn't take you to the right character if you don't get the stroke order right. Oh, wow. And that's one of the reasons why I like it, because the fact that, like, sorry, I'm one of those people who still thinks, and one of the other things I want to say is, I have this young guy that I interviewed for Yale School of Management, who ended up going to another school, but he shared with me one of his essays, which I think everyone on this call will appreciate, where he was supposed to talk about, like, Japanese culture and the uniqueness of Japanese culture. And the example that he gave was how when writing characters, you must get the stroke order correct. And because it does not matter if the end product looks right, the process is what's important. And this is an analogy to a lot of aspects of Japanese culture. And he said that's why, if you do the strokes in the wrong order, it's wrong, even if the finished product is the same. And so, that brings me back to Wisho touch. Well, is that really important? At this stage, is it really important? I mean, it's important to me because I went to a lot of trouble to learn the stroke order. So for me, it's important. And so I always use Wisho touch.
That is a good, even in the workplace though. Yeah,
absolutely.
Certainly, I think we all encounter, where we thought we got to the right answer, but we did it the wrong way. So yeah, I think that's quite valid. Any other questions? I see in the registration, someone asked, what can a recent university graduate with a BA in Japanese do to get involved in the defense industry?
That's a good question. The first question is, what's your nationality? If your nationality is American, probably a lot. If your nationality is Chinese and you're interested in the U.S. defense industry, probably nothing. I think that a Japanese company, a lot of it is timing. If you're talking about like working in Japan, timing is absolutely critical. Another thing to know about the big Japanese, the big American companies that do business in Japan is that they are first or second technocracies, but second or first, they're old boys clubs. And you're not going to break in with only a BS. You're not going to break in as a BS with only 6 or 7 years of experience. And what I would say, if you're interested in Japan and defense, what I would tell you is that you should join American defense aerospace company in the United States. You should become an expert in some aspect of the business. And I would say, what are some of the aspects of the business that are important? Whatever say you're at MECI, for example, and you went to University of Wisconsin, you did the technical Japanese program, and you have a MECI degree. Go into the mechanical area, become an expert in some mechanical area, maybe get an MBA or a graduate school degree, whatever it is. Do a good job with every assignment you're ever given so that you're well liked and well thought of in the company. And make it known to people that you're interested in Japan. Make it known to people that you have a certain level of language capability. Volunteer to be an assistant or a facilitator for any Japanese visits to the American company. When Japanese people come, whether it's taking them to dinner, taking them to the bathroom, a lot of times they don't get to go to the bathroom by themselves. They need an escort. Volunteer to escort the Japanese. Make friends with the people who care. If you make friends with the people who care, and they remember you, the next time some Japanese come to town, they'll ask you to help. And maybe when they're going to make a visit to Japan, they'll ask you to come along. I think that's kind of a lot, but those are some concrete things you can do.
That really resonates with me, definitely getting to know people early on just by helping them out, or taking them to dinner, escorting them to Mitsukoshi to buy a souvenir, all that kind of stuff actually goes a long way. Excellent. Thanks, Dan.
In chat about Harris, about L3 Harris. Do we have time for another?
You have a question? I see Misha just asked a question. Is that
Misha,
what you're?
Misha's
Go ahead.
Okay, so the question is, does L3 Harris Japan also work in remote sensing for the purpose of environmental monitoring, or is it just defense? And it's an excellent question. No, L3 Harris is not just defense. And when it comes to environmental monitoring, meteorological imaging, that's actually our biggest thing. At the present time, in terms of money, that's our biggest thing in Japan. That's a short answer to the question, but L3 Harris does a lot more than just defense. And We do civil safety. We do air traffic control. We do pilot training for airline pilots. We do simulators for airline pilots. We do all kinds of simulation work for disaster management and stuff like that. So there's and you know, please reach out to me, you know, separately, you know, and I can talk you blue in the face on what we do.
Excellent. Misha joined a hike we had in Kamakura a month or two ago, and yeah, I know she's this is an area that we discussed even a little bit, sort of sensors and cartography and things like that. So yeah, please do, Misha, if you stick around, we can chat now. All right, well, we're just past the hour. I think we'll see how many people stick around. Maybe we'll continue the open Q&A for a few more minutes, but I think I'll let Jasmine, were you going to wrap up, or should I just?
I believe that was for you. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just go ahead and then wrap up. So thanks everyone. We build these as a 1 hour event. So if you have to drop off, feel free to do so. Beautiful Saturday morning here in Tokyo. Friday evening in US time zones. So thanks for coming yet again. Thank you, Dan, for being so open and sharing with us. And we look forward to seeing everyone again soon. I think there's one more slide. We always look for feedback on these events. You can check out our past YouTube videos. And we're also looking for, as Jasmine is beginning her job hunt after the IUC wrapped up, we're going to be saying goodbye to Jasmine on this humble Jimukyoku. We're always looking for volunteers. So if you or someone you know might want to get involved in producing these events, you get to meet some really interesting people. Going into this, you know, we had 2 or 3 chats with Dan, which is always, even just the preparations, quite fun and interesting. So reach out to us if you think you might be interested. So with that, thanks everyone. And I think Jasmine and Tarani have to go, but Dan's going to stick around. I'll be here for a half hour. And if we have enough people, we might split into groups, but otherwise I think we'll just continue the Q&A.